The first time I met Evelyn was in the underground parking garage at Bennett Group headquarters. It had just rained that day. The concrete floor glistened with moisture, and the tires made a crisp sound as they rolled through the puddles. I was standing by the elevator waiting for the HR manager when a low engine roar suddenly came from behind me. A black business sedan drove up slowly. The car stopped in front of me. The back door opened. She stepped out. A white suit, sharply tailored. High heels struck the damp ground with a crisp sound. She looked as if she had just been taken out of a freezer. Clean, cold, without a trace of excess warmth. Yet her eyes were very bright, like a window left unlatched at night. 24 years old, the youngest executive director of the Bennett Group, and one of the women in all of New York whom no one dares to provoke lightly. She walked past me. After taking 2 steps, she suddenly stopped. "What's your name?" I looked up. "Noah." She looked at me for 2 seconds. Her gaze slid from my face to my shoulders, then settled on my stance. I later learned that was her standard procedure for assessing whether someone posed a threat. Like a security scan. "New here?" "Yeah." "What did you do before?" "Security." She frowned slightly. "Have you worked for anyone?" "Many." "Have you protected any important figures?" I thought about it for a moment. "Yes." She stared at me. "How many have died?" I paused for a second. I really hadn't encountered that question before. "None." She smiled for the first time. Faintly. Just the corners of her mouth moved. But I remembered it for a long time. She turned to look at the HR manager beside her. "Starting today, he's with me." The manager paused for a moment, then quickly nodded. "Yes, Miss Evelyn." I glanced at her. She was already walking toward the elevator. I followed. "Understood." The elevator doors opened. I held the door for her. She walked in, then suddenly turned her face to look at me. "You're not going to ask why?" "I do whatever the boss tells me to do." "I do whatever the boss tells me to do." She raised an eyebrow. "You're obedient." "This is work." The elevator doors slowly closed. At the very last second, I heard her softly say, "I hope you stay this obedient." I didn't think much of it at the time. I only found out later. She would say this sentence to me many times over the next few years. Sometimes as a joke. Sometimes as a complaint. And other times she was truly angry. It wasn't until I became Evelyn's personal security that I truly understood why the outside world called her the Ice Queen. She joined the Bennett Group Board of Directors at 24. Her father, Richard Bennett, is the group's chairman, while she is responsible for corporate strategy and new projects, and is also the strongest candidate for the next CEO. She is very smart, and very domineering. At board meetings, as soon as she spoke, those directors in their 40s and 50s would subconsciously sit up straight. But she was not welcomed by everyone, especially her uncle, Michael. Michael was Richard's own younger brother and the second largest individual shareholder of the Bennett Group. He had always believed that a 24-year-old woman had no right to control such a massive group. So he never missed any opportunity to publicly question Evelyn. After the first board meeting ended, Evelyn returned to her office. The moment the door closed, the woman who hadn't even blinked in the conference room suddenly seemed to have been drained of all her strength. She leaned back into her chair, eyes closed, without saying a word. I handed her a glass of water. "Thank you." I glanced at the time. "You took on 7 people today." She opened her eyes. "Is there?" "Yes." "They deserve it." I smiled. She stared at me. "Do you think I'm fierce?" "It was okay." "What do you mean by, okay?" "You're actually quite gentle with me." She paused for a moment, clearly taken aback. Then she turned her face away. "That's because you're useful." "Oh, don't overthink it." "I didn't think much of it." She gave a soft snort, but hugged the water I handed her to her chest, as if holding a hot water bottle. I didn't say anything more. From that day on, I noticed she was getting more and more used to my presence. When she had meetings, I waited outside the door. When she worked overtime, I stayed with her late into the night. When she went on business trips, I went along. Once, The plane encountered severe turbulence. The entire cabin suddenly shook violently. Evelyn's face turned pale instantly, yet she kept a straight face. "Are you scared?" I asked.
No.
The plane jolted sharply again. Her hand quietly reached over and grabbed my sleeve. I looked down. She immediately let go. "I just wasn't sitting steady just now." "I know. What are you laughing at?" "I'm not laughing." She glared at me. "You dare laugh at me?" I really didn't laugh. She fell silent for a few seconds. Then, she put her hand back again. This time, she didn't let go. What truly changed our relationship was a late night of working overtime. That night at 9 o'clock, the board meeting had not yet ended. 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. The conference room finally fell silent. I waited outside for half an hour. There was still no movement inside. I pushed the door open. Evelyn was asleep at the desk. The computer screen was still on. Beside her was a cup of cold coffee. I walked over and shut down the computer. I took off my coat and gently draped it over her shoulders. She suddenly woke up. "Is it over?" "It's over." She rubbed her eyes. "What time is it?" 11:30. She froze for a moment. "This late?" "Yeah." She stood up. Her body swayed a little from lying down for too long. I instinctively steadied her. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned on my shoulder. A few seconds passed. She suddenly asked, "Noah, am I useless?" I paused for a moment. "Why do you say that?" "Everyone thinks I'm only sitting here because my last name is Bennett." Her voice was soft. "I've tried so hard, yet they still don't believe in me." I fell silent for a few seconds. "Then let them keep on not believing." She looked up at me. "What do you mean?" "You'll make them believe it eventually anyway." She looked at me for a long time. "You believe me?" "I do." "Why?" "Because I've seen you still revising the proposal at 3 in the morning." Her eyes flickered slightly. "Have you been watching all along?" "I am your bodyguard." She smiled faintly. Then, in a low voice, she said, "Then keep watching me from now on." I nodded. "Okay." That night, I drove her home. The car stopped at the entrance, but she didn't get out. I asked, "What's wrong?" She looked down at her hands. After a long while, she suddenly unbuckled her seatbelt. Then she hugged me. I froze completely. Her face was pressed against my shoulder. "Just a hug." I didn't move. "Don't move." "Okay." A few seconds later, she added, "You're not allowed to tell anyone." "Why?" "I don't act like this in front of other people." I smiled. "Got it." She looked up. Her face was completely red. "What are you laughing at?" "Nothing." "Annoying." She pushed the car door open and ran. I sat in the car, watching her figure disappear under the porch lights. In that moment, I realized for the first time, this woman seemed to be more than just my employer. What truly made my heart race for Evelyn was not her beauty, but her ambition. That year, the group was preparing to invest in an intelligent security system. Several veteran directors unanimously opposed it. "Bennett is in real estate and finance. Why get involved with such a capital-intensive tech project? Young people always like to chase trends. This project might not turn a profit even in 3 years." Evelyn didn't argue. After the meeting, everyone left, but she stayed behind alone. She read through the proposal again and again. Finally, she picked up a red pen and wrote in a blank space. "In the next 3 years, the traditional security industry will definitely be reshaped by technology. If we don't enter the market now, we won't even be able to get a foothold 3 years from now." She pressed down hard with the pen tip, almost piercing the paper. I stood behind her, looking at that sentence. In that moment, I suddenly understood. What the board members saw was cost. She saw the future. Later, the project was not canceled, although its scale was cut in half. But Evelyn still insisted on retaining the core R&D. It was also from that time on that I first seriously thought about a question. If one day she really becomes the one at the helm of the Bennett Group, what would it be like? She started leaving breakfast for me. Whenever I returned from a mission, her first words were always, "Are you hurt?" Once I scraped my arm. It wasn't a big wound. Yet, right in front of the secretary, she grabbed my hand. "What happened?" "Just a scrape." "You call that just a scrape when it's bleeding?" The secretary stood to the side, her expression extremely colorful. I cleared my throat lightly. "Mississippi." Only then did she realize she had overreacted. She immediately let go and put on a stern face. "Go to the hospital." "It's really nothing." I said go to the hospital. "Okay." Later, the secretary told me, Evelyn had secretly instructed, before he goes on a mission, you must confirm his protective equipment. The secretary asked, "Why?" She fell silent for a few seconds. "Because he is my man." The secretary laughed for a long time. Our first date was at a very ordinary restaurant. No luxury cars. No assistants. No bodyguards. Evelyn even wore a hat and a mask. She sat across from me. Lowering her voice, she said, "This way, no one will recognize me." I looked at her. "Are you sure?" "Sure." The next second, a waiter passed by. The tray in his hand nearly fell. Aren't you Miss Evelyn?" "Evelyn." "Me." She grabbed my hand. "Run." We ran all the way to the street corner. Finally, we sat on a park bench. Both of us were out of breath. She took off her mask. Her hair was a mess from the wind, but she laughed uncontrollably. "It's all your fault." "Why blame me? Why didn't you run earlier? Didn't you say no one knows you?" She glared at me. Then she laughed even harder. A long time passed before she finally quieted down, leaning on my shoulder. "Noah. I haven't been this happy in a long time." I looked at her hair, tousled by the wind. "We can do this often from now on." She nodded gently. "Okay." That night, she took the initiative to hold my hand for the first time. She didn't let go for a long time. Later, we got together. There were no flowers, no formal confession. One night, she stood in front of me. "Do you like me?" "I like it." "You like it a lot?" "Yeah." "So, are you willing to be with me?" "I am." She lowered her head. "Then starting today, you are my boyfriend." I laughed. "It's that simple? How complicated do you want it to be?" I reached out and hugged her. But she said seriously, "Noah. I don't like you just because you're a bodyguard." "I know. And it's not because you've protected me before." She leaned against my chest. "When others see me cry, they think I've finally shown my true colors. Only when you see me cry do you hand me water." I smiled. "Then I'll keep handing you water from now on." She nodded gently. "It's a promise." I thought that sentence would be a promise between us for a lifetime. Until 3 months later, I broke it with my own hands. On Evelyn's 27th birthday, the Bennett family held a grand banquet. That night, I stood by her side the whole time, until past 11 o'clock. Most of the guests had left. Richard found me. "Noah." I followed him to the terrace. The autumn breeze blew in from the New York night. He didn't exchange pleasantries. He directly handed me a document. "Take a look." I opened it. Inside were the capital flows of the Bennett Group over the past 3 years. Several overseas subsidiaries showed abnormal transfers. After passing through layers of companies, massive amounts of money ultimately ended up in an institution called Weston Capital. I frowned. "Michael." Richard did not answer. Could be taken as tacit agreement. "I suspect he has been transferring the group's assets." "Why not deal with it?" "Because there is no complete evidence." Richard paused. "Besides, something happened recently." He handed me his phone. On the screen was a photo. In the photo, I was walking toward Evelyn's car in the underground parking lot. The timestamp was yesterday. My expression shifted slightly. "Someone has been following me." "That's right." Richard took back his phone. "I also found out that Michael has been investigating you lately." I looked up. "Does he want to use me?" "No." Richard looked at me. "He wants to use Evelyn's feelings for you." I fell silent. If you stay by her side, he will definitely find a way through you. I'm not afraid. I know. Richard's voice lowered. But she is. I frowned. He looked toward the banquet hall. Evelyn was standing there talking to the guests. Her expression was calm. Her smile was appropriate. No one knew she had just secretly shifted her weight several times because her high heels were rubbing her feet raw. Richard said softly, "Do you know why she looks so strong? Because she's known since she was a child. The moment she shows the slightest weakness, someone will tear her apart. You are her only weakness." I clenched my fists. "Do you want me to leave?" Richard didn't answer immediately. He took out an envelope, placed it on the table. $10 million. I didn't even look. "I don't want it." "I know." He took back the envelope. "This isn't to buy you leaving." "Then what is it?" "Compensation." I sneered. "I don't need it." Richard remained silent for a long time. "I know you're not doing it for the money." He looked up. "But if you really want to protect her, you have to make Michael believe that you are completely through." I said nothing. The wind rustled the leaves on the terrace. "She will hate me. Maybe. Or maybe she'll never forgive me for the rest of her life." "I know. You still want me to go?" Richard closed his eyes. "Because I would rather she hate you for 3 years than have her die in front of me because of you." My hand slowly loosened. I asked, "If I leave, will you protect her?" Richard looked at me. "She is my daughter." I nodded. "Then that is enough." I turned around. As I reached the door, Richard suddenly said, "Noah." I stopped. "I really wish you would stay." I didn't look back. "I know." That night, Evelyn was waiting for me in the bedroom. She was wearing pajamas. Seeing me enter, she immediately reached out to me. "Come here." I didn't move. She paused for a moment. "What's wrong?" I looked at her. My throat felt as if it were clogged. I had rehearsed this in my mind countless times beforehand. But when I finally spoke, every word felt like a knife. "Let's break up." The smile on her face faded away bit by bit. "What did you say?" "We're breaking up." "Why?" "I'm bored of it." She froze. "What do you mean?" "I'm just tired of it." She stared at me. Her gaze gradually shifted from confusion to disbelief. "You don't like me anymore?" "Yeah." "You're looking at me." I raised my head. Her eyes were already red. "Noah, tell me, is it something I did wrong?" My chest felt as if it were being gripped tight by something. She stood before me, those eyes that never even blinked in the boardroom now completely red. She didn't even make a sound as she cried, just looked at me, as if waiting for a reprieve from a death sentence. I was on the verge of spilling the entire truth. Richard's words stabbed into my mind like knives. "You are her only weakness. She will die because of you." I gritted my teeth, my fingernails almost sinking into my palms. "Say it, Noah, say break up, and once you're done, you can leave." But the moment her tears fell, I almost dropped to my knees. I gritted my teeth. "No." "Then why?" "Because I don't want to go on." She gave a laugh. That laugh sounded worse than crying. "Okay." She wiped away the tears from the corner of her eye. "I understand." I turned around. I took 2 steps. Behind me came her trembling voice. "Do you really not love me anymore?" My feet stopped. In that moment, I almost turned around. I almost rushed back to hold her, to tell her that none of this was real, to tell her that I loved her more than anyone else. But I saw her face. I saw the last light in her eyes, the light that refused to go out. Only by making her completely give up hope would Michael believe that I had left her. I had to make her give up. It was a long time before I said, "I don't love you anymore." I didn't look back. The door closed behind me. In that moment, I heard her stifled sob. Just one. Very brief. Yet it felt as if something inside my chest had snapped completely. I stood outside the door, clutching a sticky note in my hand. It was one she had pasted in my notebook last month. It had only one sentence. "What do you want for breakfast tomorrow? I'll have the kitchen make it." I didn't take it with me. I placed it on her nightstand. because I was afraid that if I took it, I would never truly come back. That night, I left New York, changed all my contact information, deactivated my social media accounts. I didn't even take the watch she gave me. I went to a city where no one knew me. No Bennett, no Evelyn, and no past, only myself. My first year was a complete mess. I used all my savings to start a small security company. There were 7 of us in total, 6 employees, and me. No clients from the Bennetts. No family resources. No one was willing to believe that a former bodyguard in his 20s could accomplish anything. When I went to pitch my first client, they even asked me, "Didn't you used to be Miss Bennett's bodyguard?" "Yes." "So what makes you think you can handle corporate security?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know myself. The first month, the company almost couldn't pay salaries. The second month, we lost our biggest client. The third month, my partner Daniel said to me, "Noah, we might not be able to keep going." I sat in the office, looking out the window. Suddenly, I remembered something Evelyn had once said. In the next 3 years, traditional security will definitely be restructured by technology. I stared at the security report on the desk. Suddenly I asked, if we don't protect people, what if we protect data? Daniel was stunned. I wrote down all the problems I encountered when doing security in the past. Blind spots in surveillance, identity forgery, internal permissions, emergency response, human error in judgment. Then I said, let's build a system. Let the machine detect the danger first. Then humans handle it. That night, Eagle Security truly began its transformation. In the first year, we built our first intelligent security system. No one believed in it, so I took the system to clients myself. A small financial company was willing to give us a chance. 19 days after the system went live, it detected an abnormal login attempt in advance. We avoided a major data leak because of this. That company didn't cancel the contract. Instead, they recommended us to another enterprise. The second year, we began expanding into banks, airports, and data centers. The third year, Eagle Security was valued at over $300 million. And I still do not make public appearances. Daniel is the public-facing CEO. I appear only as the largest investor and the technical lead. But there is one more thing. No one knows. For 3 years, I have never stopped investigating Michael. It wasn't until the second year that I first realized Weston Capital was no ordinary investment firm. Its capital flows were strange. Money came out of the Bennett Group, passed through 4 layers of overseas companies, finally entered Weston. But what truly alerted me was, Weston never actually used this money. It was only responsible for hiding the funds. This means, the real beneficiary is still behind. I traced the money trail for a whole year. It wasn't until the third year that I finally found the definitive evidence. The actual controller of Weston Capital is an offshore company controlled by Michael. And I did something even bolder. I bought Weston Capital. From that day on, every illegal transfer Michael made entered my database. He thought he was transferring assets, but in reality he was leaving evidence for me. 3 years later, the Bennett Group signed a strategic partnership agreement with Eagle Security. This was my first official appearance at a Bennett Group public event. Not long after the press conference began, a 5 or 6-year-old boy suddenly ran out from the back row, clutching a lopsided robot toy in his arms. He ran up to me, suddenly stopped, looked up at me for a long time. "Uncle. You look just like the person in my mom's photo." I froze. "What photo?" "A photo by my mother's bedside." My heart suddenly sank. Almost at the same instant, I involuntarily raised my head, my gaze sweeping across the sea of people to search for that familiar figure. Then I saw Evelyn. She stood on the other side of the hall, looking toward us. Her expression was calm, yet her hand was tightly clutching the hem of her skirt, her knuckles turning white. When she saw my glance sweep over, she clearly froze for a moment, then quickly turned her face away. But in that instant when she thought I hadn't noticed her yet, I saw a flicker of near uncontrollable tremor in her eyes, as if something had suddenly cracked open inside her heart. Just then, a familiar voice came from the other side of the hall. Arlo. I looked up, and then I saw her. Evelyn. 3 years since we last met. She was thinner than before. Long hair draped over her shoulders. Black suit. Still cold and glamorous. Still the ice queen no one dared approach. But the moment she saw me, the ice in her eyes completely shattered. She stood there, not saying a word. Neither did I. Arlo ran back to her side, looked up, and shouted, "Mommy!" She lowered her head, stroked his hair, then looked at me. "Long time no see." I nodded. "Long time no see. How have you been?" "Pretty good. Do you have a girlfriend?" I shook my head. "No." She lowered her eyes. "Oh." Just a single word, yet like a needle, gently piercing into my heart. The press conference ended. She didn't chase after me, and I didn't reach out to her either. Nighttime. A message came from an unfamiliar number. "Do you have time tomorrow?" I stared at the screen. No reply. A second message quickly appeared. "I want to talk to you." I eventually replied with a single word. "Okay." The next afternoon. We met at a cafe. She sat by the window. When she saw me come in, her fingers visibly tightened. "What would you like to drink?" "Coffee." "The same kind as before?" I paused for a moment. "You remember?" She lowered her head. "I remember." The waiter left. The two of them remained silent for a long time. In the end, she was the one to speak first. "You've had a good 3 years. It's all right. Eagle Security is really formidable now. Luck." She looked up at me. "You're still the same." "What?" "You wouldn't tell me anything." I didn't speak. Her eyes slowly reddened. "Is it my father?" I looked up. Her voice was very soft. "Did he force you to leave?" Silence. She suddenly gave a faint smile. "I knew it. It wasn't because you didn't love me. You were never that kind of person." I frowned. "Evelyn." She shook her head. "You don't need to explain." She looked out the window. 3 years ago, I didn't understand. I kept thinking that I wasn't good enough. Later, I found out that wasn't it. She looked up. "Noah, I waited for you for half a year. Then I waited another year. After that, I told myself that if you really didn't want to come back, I wouldn't wait anymore." She smiled a little. "But I couldn't do it." My chest tightened sharply. "For the past 3 years, I haven't dated. I haven't married. Not because I wanted to prove anything. Just because." She paused. "I'm still waiting for an answer." I remained silent for a long time. Then I asked, "What about Arlo?" She was clearly taken aback. "You think he's my child?" "Isn't it?" She shook her head. "He is my brother Lucas's son." I was stunned. "Lucas was in a car accident 3 years ago." She lowered her head. "The child's mother left later on, so I took Arlo in." I finally understood why that child called her mom. And I also understood why Richard never told me about this 3 years ago. She suddenly asked, "Do you remember that sticky note?" I froze. "What?" "The one you left on my nightstand the night you left." My breath hitched for a moment. She looked at me. "What do you want for breakfast tomorrow?" "You know, because I kept it." She smiled faintly. That night, I cried for a long time. Later, I got up to drink some water and saw it. I suddenly thought, a person who truly doesn't love me. Her voice began to tremble. How could they, before leaving, still care what I want for breakfast the next morning? I lowered my head. "I'm sorry. I don't want an apology." "I know." "Then what do you want?" I looked at her. She reached out her hand. "I want you to tell me first if anything happens in the future." I fell silent for 2 seconds. "Okay. Stop making decisions for me." "Okay. And don't disappear suddenly again." "Okay." She slowly pulled a document from her bag. A 4-paper, printed in lead type, with a line of small text at the end, in bold. The breaching party must pay liquidated damages to the non-breaching party in the amount of $100 million. I paused for a moment. What is this? She pushed the document in front of me without batting an eyelash. A commitment letter. The body consisted of only one sentence. Noah promises that, from the date of signing this commitment letter, he shall not, for any reason, voluntarily disappear, cut off contact, or make a unilateral decision to separate from Evelyn. She handed me a pen. Sign it. I glanced at her. $100 million penalty? Yeah. I don't have $100 million right now. Your company is valued at $300 million. She raised her chin. Sign it. It's not too late to back out now. I couldn't help but laugh. This is contract fraud. I am the CEO of the Bennett Group. I have signed more contracts than you have had meals. So you're using a contract to chase a boyfriend? Her composure finally cracked, and her face flushed for a moment, but she remained stubborn. As the founder of Eagle Security, you really ought to learn to honor the spirit of the contract. I lowered my head, looked at that letter of commitment, and smiled. Then, in the seat opposite her, I signed my name. She took back the document, carefully folded it, and put it in her bag. All right, she looked at me. Now you owe me $100 million. So if you run again, I'll have the entire legal team in New York chase you to the ends of the earth. I looked at her. And what about you? What about me? What do you owe me? She froze for a moment. I reached out and held her hand. You owe me 3 years of dinners. You can pay me back slowly. Her eyes slowly reddened. Then she stood up, walked around the table, and in front of everyone in the cafe, leaned down to hug me. The sunlight that afternoon was lovely. For the first time, I felt that the winter of these 3 years had finally come to an end. Evelyn didn't ask me to come back to her right away. She just reappeared in my life, bringing me breakfast, waiting for me at the company entrance, delivering the steak I used to like to my office. Once, I looked at her. What exactly are you trying to do? She didn't bat an eye. Chase you. I almost choked on my coffee. What? I said. I'm pursuing you. You are Evelyn. I know. You're chasing me? Is there a problem? No. That's good. She turned and left. At the door, she suddenly looked back. Are you free tonight? I'm busy. She was silent for 2 seconds. What about tomorrow? I'm busy then too. She gritted her teeth. Someday you'll be free. Watching her retreating figure, I couldn't help but smile. 3 years ago, I was the one chasing after her. 3 years later, it's her turn to chase me. Arlo soon became her accomplice. One night, he sneaked into my office, clutching that worn-out robot toy. Uncle. Do you like my mommy? I froze. Why do you ask? Because she likes you. He said it with a straight face. She looks at your photos every night. Sometimes she even cries. My heart ached. She cried. Yeah. He looked at me earnestly. Don't make her cry anymore. I rubbed his head. Okay. He asked again. Then when will you be my dad? I almost choked on the water. That question. You should ask your mom. Arlo nodded. Okay. I hurriedly grabbed him. Don't ask her now. Why? Because I'm afraid she'll kill me. Arlo laughed his head off. Later I found out. That robot was made by Lucas for Arlo. After it broke, Evelyn would help him fix it from time to time. Arlo told me, Mom never talks when she's fixing things. After she fixes them, she gives me a hug. I remained silent for a long time. I finally realized, over the past 3 years, what Evelyn had to endure. Perhaps it was no less than what I bore. The real storm came half a year later. Richard asked to meet me alone. 3 years had passed. He had clearly aged a lot. Did she tell you? Yeah. Blame me. I shook my head. You weren't wrong back then. Richard gave a bitter smile. I was wrong. He raised his glass. I thought protecting her was loving her. It turned out I just locked her in an even colder cage. He handed me a document. Michael has gone too far over the past 3 years. He has been transferring the group's assets. I'm getting old. There are some things I can no longer keep an eye on. I opened the document. Weston Capital. I smiled. Do you know who the boss is behind this company? Richard shook his head. I closed the file. Me. He looked up abruptly. What? Weston Capital is now under an investment arm of Eagle Security. And I have been tracking Michael since the second year. Richard froze. When did you find out? The second year. Why didn't you tell Evelyn? Because there was no evidence. I looked at him. Now there is. Richard remained silent for a long time. Suddenly he smiled. Do you know? What? You are no longer the bodyguard standing before me from 3 years ago. I shook my head. I haven't changed. I just finally have the ability to stand by her side. 3 days later, the Bennett Group convened an emergency board meeting. Michael struck first. Evelyn is no longer fit to continue serving as CEO. The conference room fell silent. Evelyn sat in the main seat. Her expression was calm. Reason. Michael slammed a stack of documents onto the table. Multiple group projects have suffered losses over the past 3 years. Furthermore, her private relationships with outsiders have seriously impacted company decisions. The screen lit up. A photo appeared. It was a photo of me and Evelyn sitting on a park bench from 3 years ago. Whispers broke out in the conference room. Michael sneered. Risking the entire group for a man. What right do you have to sit in this position? Evelyn looked at the screen. Her face was expressionless. Is there more? Michael was taken aback. You. Continue. Michael gritted his teeth. You are not qualified to sit here. Evelyn stood up. Then let's vote. The voting began. The smile on Michael's face grew increasingly obvious. He had already secured the support of 4 directors. But the moment the results came out, his smile vanished. Evelyn received support from more than 2/3. Michael looked sharply at Richard. You transferred the shares to her? Richard did not answer. Evelyn, however, spoke up. Father simply believes in his daughter. Michael's face was livid. You think this is the end? No. A voice rang out from the back of the conference room. Everyone turned their heads. I stood up. I walked step by step to the center of the conference room. Michael stared at me. What right does a bodyguard have to stand here? I smiled. You remember me? Of course. That's good. I turned on the projector. The first document. Cash flow. The second document. Bank transfer records. The third document. Authorization documents. The fourth document. Emails between Michael and the overseas company. The fifth document. Certificate of beneficial ownership of Weston Capital. The conference room grew increasingly quiet. Michael's face turned from livid to deathly pale. These are all fake. I didn't answer, because the one who actually spoke was Evelyn. She stood up, walked to the screen, opened another document. I glanced at it. I was stunned. It was Evelyn's own audit report. The time span was also 3 years. She said calmly, Michael, I discovered the first record of your fund transfers in the second year. Michael looked up abruptly. You know? Of course. Then why don't you handle it? Evelyn looked at him. Because there isn't enough evidence. She turned to look at me. I'm waiting. I nodded. I'm waiting too. Evelyn looked back at Michael. You always thought I was just a young woman relying on her father. So you gave me 3 years. And you gave Noah 3 years. Michael's expression completely changed. Evelyn picked up the document on the table. Today, the final piece of the puzzle is complete. She immediately announced the freezing of all management authorities under Michael's name and initiated a comprehensive internal audit. Soon, the police intervened. Michael was taken away. As he passed me, he paused for a moment and looked at me coldly. Do you think you've won? I replied calmly. It's not that I won. I looked toward Evelyn. It's her. Michael was taken away. The conference room finally fell silent. After everyone else had left, only the 2 of us remained in the conference room. Evelyn stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, her back to me. I walked over, but she didn't turn around. Did you know about Weston Capital all along? Yeah. Why didn't you tell me? Because I promised you. She turned around. What? I won't make decisions for you anymore. She looked at me. Her eyes turned red little by little. Noah. Thank you. I smiled. No need to thank me this time. Why? Because you won this yourself. She fell silent for a few seconds. Then she suddenly walked over and hugged me, burying her face in my chest. But I still want to thank you. I reached out and held her. She was a little lighter than 3 years ago, but the feeling of holding her in my arms hadn't changed at all. After a long time, she whispered, "Don't leave this time." No. Really? Really? Tell me wherever you go from now on. Okay. You can't change your number. Okay. You can't just disappear. Okay. And you can't just take me. I lowered my head and kissed her. She fell silent. A few seconds later, she pushed me away, blushing. What are you doing? Shut you up. She glared at me in anger. You are becoming less and less like the obedient bodyguard you used to be. I smiled. Do you still want me or not? She was silent for 2 seconds. I do. 6 months later. It was Evelyn's birthday. I had prepared a surprise, but she found out early. I came home in the evening. She stood in the middle of the living room, arms crossed over her chest. Noah. Are you planning to propose? I was taken aback. How did you know? You've been acting sneaky all day. She walked up to me. Beg now. In such a hurry? I've been waiting for 3 years. Let me prepare. No. Why? She looked at me. Because I don't want to wait any longer. I smiled. Then I got down on one knee. She froze for a moment. I took out the ring. Actually, I prepared this a long time ago. Her eyes instantly turned red. When? A month ago. Why didn't you tell me? I wanted to surprise you. She sniffled. I hate surprises. And now. She reached out. I like it. I put the ring on her finger. The next second, she suddenly crouched down and hugged me, curling her whole body into my arms. Noah. I really hate you. Why? Because you made me wait for 3 years. I'm sorry. So you have to make it up to me from now on. How will you make it up to me? She thought for a moment. Pay for a lifetime. I smiled. Deal. The wedding did not invite too much media. Only family and a few close friends. No commercial coverage. No reporters. No so-called lavish banquet. Only the closest people. Evelyn is wearing a white wedding dress, walking toward me step by step. I stood on the stage. Suddenly, I remembered that night 3 years ago. She was wearing pajamas. With red eyes, she asked me, "Do you really not love me anymore?" Back then, I didn't look back. Now, she has finally walked up to me. The priest asked, Noah, do you take Evelyn to be your wife? I do. For better or for worse? I do. It was Evelyn's turn. Yet she did not answer immediately. She looked at me. There was a light in her eyes. Noah. I have a request. The people below the stage paused for a moment. I smiled. Go ahead. No matter what happens in the future, you must tell me. You cannot decide on your own. I nodded. Okay. She finally smiled. Then I will. Applause rang out. Beside me, Arlo muttered under his breath. Finally getting married. Evelyn immediately turned her head. Arlo. The little guy shrank his neck. I didn't say anything. I couldn't help but laugh. Evelyn glared at me. You're laughing at me too? No. You were clearly laughing. I looked at her. I'm laughing because my wife is too beautiful. Her face instantly turned red. Shut up. Okay, wifey. She became even more embarrassed. The 3rd year of marriage. An ordinary weekday evening. I pushed open the door to our home. The light was still on in the living room. Evelyn was curled up on the sofa. The computer rested on her lap. She had already fallen asleep. On the screen was a new project proposal. I walked over, gently closed the computer. She woke up in a daze. "You're back." "Yeah." "What time is it?" 11 o'clock. She sat up. "How did I fall asleep?" "Because you worked overtime again." "The last document." "You said that last time too." She pouted. "Then carry me." I bent down and scooped her up directly. She naturally wrapped her arms around my neck. After walking a couple of steps, I realized she was wearing my white shirt. "My clothes." "Yeah." "Why are you wearing mine?" "It's comfortable. There are so many pajamas in the wardrobe. Yours is the best." I was helpless. "When will you return it?" She thought about it seriously. "I don't know." "Then what will I wear?" "Buy more." I smiled. "Okay." I had just reached the staircase when a small head suddenly peeked out from upstairs. Arlo had grown quite a bit taller. "Dad, not asleep yet?" "No." He glanced at Evelyn in my arms. His shoulders started to shake. He was clearly holding back a laugh. "Mom is wearing your clothes again." Evelyn looked up. "Arlo." The little guy immediately shrank back. "I didn't say anything." Evelyn pinched my ear. "Your son is bullying me. Isn't he your nephew?" "He's your son now too." From upstairs came the sound of Arlo unable to hold back his laughter. Evelyn leaned back into my arms. A few seconds passed. Then she suddenly asked softly, "Noah, what time will you be back tomorrow?" "Around 6. Be more precise." 6 o'clock. "What if it's a minute late?" "What are you going to do?" She thought for a moment. "I'll punish you by having you eat with me." I raised an eyebrow. "That's serious?" "Yeah." "Then I'll try to be early." She nodded in satisfaction and buried her face in my shoulder. I held her and continued walking upstairs. We reached the bedroom door. Suddenly, she asked again, "Noah, do you remember what I said 3 years ago when you left?" I stopped. "I remember. I said you would regret it." She smiled. "So, do you regret it?" I looked down at her. "Regret." Her gaze darkened for an instant. I added, "I regret not telling you the truth sooner." She didn't speak. I lowered my head and kissed her forehead. "If I had known 3 years ago that you would be willing to face this with me, I wouldn't have made you wait for 3 years." She held me tight. After a long while, she whispered softly, "Then you know now." "Yeah." "Don't make the same mistake again."
No.
"Is that a promise?" "It's a deal." She finally smiled. "Then see you at 6 tomorrow." I paused for a moment. "Aren't you going on a business trip tomorrow?" She blinked. "So you remember?" "Of course." "Then I won't go." "Why?" She hugged my neck tightly and said matter-of-factly, "Because I want to have dinner with you." Arlo's voice came from upstairs. "Mom, didn't you say yesterday that you had a very important meeting?" Evelyn remained expressionless. "Cancelled." "Why?" She glanced at me. The corners of her mouth slowly curled up. "Because someone owes me 3 years of dinners." I paused for a second. Then I smiled. "Okay. I'll treat you tomorrow." She leaned into my arms. She didn't ask again if I would leave. And I didn't make any more promises. I just held her and pushed open the bedroom door. Suddenly, she whispered in my ear, "Noah, welcome home." I tightened my arms. "I'm back." Many years later, one day Arlo dug up the copy of the commitment letter. He looked at the amount of the penalty fee with a shocked expression on his face. "Mom, $100 million?" Evelyn was brewing coffee in the kitchen. She didn't look back. "Yes." "Dad really signed it?" "He did." "Isn't he afraid he won't be able to pay?" Evelyn walked into the living room with her coffee. She glanced at me. The corners of her mouth curled up in a slight smile. "So for the rest of his life, he'll have to stay obediently by my side." I sat on the sofa. I lowered my head and smiled. Arlo rolled his eyes. "You two are really childish." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "What did you say?" Arlo quickly stood up. I'm going to do my homework. The little guy dashed upstairs. The living room fell silent. Evelyn walked over, sat down beside me, rested her head on my shoulder. The coffee in the cup was steaming. Outside the window was dusk in New York. Golden light streamed in through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She suddenly said, "Noah. Thank you for coming back." I turned my head, looking at her profile, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. "I never really left." She didn't speak. She just held my hand a little tighter. Outside the window, the twilight was deepening. But the night that belonged to us was just beginning.